The first time my husband called me useless in court, he didn't raise his voice. That was the part that stayed with me afterward. He stood beside his attorney in a navy suit I had once helped him choose for a fundraising dinner in Boston, his hand resting lightly against the edge of the table, and said it the way someone comments on the weather. "She hasn't worked in over 20 years. My wife is emotionally overwhelmed, financially dependent, and frankly, she's just a useless housewife." The courtroom went still in that strange bureaucratic way. Silence settles in government buildings. No gasps, no drama. Just the low hum of fluorescent lights and the faint clicking of the court reporter's keys. I kept my hands folded in my lap. Then Judge Elena Morales looked away from my husband and toward his attorney. Not angry, not surprised, interested. "Counselor," she said carefully, "do you truly not know who Mrs. Whitmore is?" For the first time that morning, Richard stopped looking comfortable. Courtroom 7B sat on the 4th floor of the Norfolk County Courthouse in Dedham, Massachusetts. The room was smaller than television, had taught people to expect no polished wood grandeur, no dramatic gallery, packed with strangers waiting for scandal, just worn benches, beige walls, and a radiator near the window that hissed every few minutes like it was tired of doing its job. Outside, freezing rain tapped softly against the glass. Inside, my husband was trying to convince a judge that I could no longer be trusted with my own life. "My name is Margaret Whitmore. I am 57 years old. I was married to Richard Whitmore for 32 years. 3 weeks before that hearing, Richard filed an emergency petition requesting temporary conservatorship over my finances and medical decisions. According to him, the death of my older sister had destabilized me emotionally. He claimed I had become forgetful, withdrawn, and unable to manage practical matters. The petition described me as vulnerable, dependent, and fragile. It was written carefully enough to sound compassionate. That was always Richard's talent. Cruelty sounds different when educated people perform it politely. His attorney, Daniel Mercer, spent nearly 15 minutes building the image before Richard ever spoke. "Mrs. Whitmore no longer participates in major financial decisions. Mrs. Whitmore has isolated herself since the passing of her sister Evelyn. Mrs. Whitmore struggles with emotional regulation and executive judgment." Each sentence was placed gently like another brick in a wall they assumed I wouldn't notice being built around me. And for a while maybe I hadn't. Richard stood beside the table wearing the expression I had watched him use on investors, doctors, school administrators, and grieving relatives for over 3 decades, concerned, steady, exhausted by responsibility. It was the face of a man people trusted instinctively. That face had opened doors for him our entire marriage. I looked down at the edge of the table instead of at him directly. There was a faint water stain in the wood, shaped almost like a crooked circle. Tiny details become useful when you are trying not to react too soon. Richard had always relied on reaction. If I became emotional, he would call me unstable. If I became angry, he would call me irrational. If I defended myself too quickly, he would tilt his head slightly and ask the room to notice how defensive I sounded. So I stayed still. People misunderstand silence. They think it means weakness because they cannot imagine someone withholding words intentionally. But silence can also be observation, and I had spent most of my marriage observing. The first time Richard implied I was incapable of understanding money was 11 years earlier in our kitchen in Wellesley. Our son Ethan had just left for college. Claire was still in high school. I was standing near the counter sorting insurance paperwork for my father after his bypass surgery, while Richard scrolled through market updates on his phone. "You don't need to stress yourself with all that," he said casually. "Numbers were never really your thing." I remember stopping for half a second, not because the sentence hurt, but because it surprised me. I had handled nearly every major financial record in our household for years, before Richard slowly repositioned himself as the practical one. Taxes, schedules, estate, paperwork, trust documents for his mother, most of it had crossed my desk first. But he had started revising history gradually, the way careful people repaint old walls one layer at a time. "She gets overwhelmed with details," he would say at dinner parties when conversations turned financial, or "Margaret prefers simpler things." Everyone always smiled warmly when he said it, including me. At the time, I told myself it wasn't worth correcting. What I did not understand then was that repetition eventually hardens into identity if nobody interrupts it. By the time Evelyn died, even our children had started unconsciously accepting Richard's version of me, not cruelly, just quietly. My sister passed away in October after a 2-year fight with ovarian cancer. During those final months, I spent more nights in hospital chairs than in my own bed. Richard stepped in constantly during that period. He handled calls, scheduled meetings, and organized estate paperwork while I focused on Evelyn's care. "You shouldn't carry everything alone," he kept telling me. At the time, it sounded supportive. Grief changes the standards by which we measure trust. Exhaustion lowers them further. Then 2 weeks after the funeral, I received the petition. I was sitting alone in Evelyn's dining room when the courier arrived. Rain streaked softly down the windows. Her coffee mug still sat beside the sink because I had not yet been able to move it. I remember reading the first page once, then again more slowly. Emotionally diminished financial confusion, inability to recognize risk. The language was clinical enough to sound objective, but underneath it was something colder. Richard wasn't trying to protect me, he was positioning me. That same week, one of Evelyn's estate accounts flagged irregular activity requiring additional verification. The bank representative spoke carefully professionally, but her tone changed when she realized I understood compliance terminology better than she expected. After the call ended, I sat very still in my sister's empty house, with the file open across my lap, and for the first time in months, the grief moved aside long enough for something else to settle into place. Pattern recognition. Back in courtroom 7B, Judge Morales looked from Richard to me again. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "you've been unusually quiet this morning." "Yes, Your Honor." "Is there a reason for that?" I lifted my eyes fully for the first time. "Yes," I said calmly, "because my husband's case depends entirely on me staying quiet long enough for him to finish telling his version first." The room changed after that, not dramatically, just enough. Daniel Mercer shifted slightly beside Richard. The court reporter stopped typing for 1 second before continuing. Even the judge leaned back differently, like someone adjusting focus on a camera lens. Richard looked at me, then really looked at me, not as his wife but as a variable he might have miscalculated. And for the first time in years I let him wonder if he had. People assume manipulation begins with cruelty. Most of the time it begins with convenience. That was the dangerous thing about Richard, he never forced his way into control. He arrived there gradually through usefulness, through calmness, through the quiet authority people automatically hand to someone who sounds certain. After Evelyn got sick, my entire life narrowed into schedules, medication charts, specialist appointments, and long drives between Boston and Providence with cold coffee sitting untouched in the cup holder beside me. There were weeks when I slept in the same sweater 3 nights in a row because changing clothes felt less urgent than answering another hospital call. Richard stepped into that chaos like someone volunteering to carry heavy boxes. "Let me handle the bank," he would say while I sat beside my sister's hospital bed reviewing insurance forms. "You focus on Evelyn, I'll take care of the administrative side." At first I was grateful. That part matters. People always want a clean villain and a clean victim because it makes stories easier to organize morally, but marriage doesn't decay that neatly. Richard was not pretending every second of our lives together. There were years when I loved him, honestly. Years when he made me laugh. Years when he sat beside me at 2 in the morning while Ethan struggled through pneumonia as a child. That history complicates recognition. You don't immediately suspect the person who has spent decades becoming familiar to you, especially when you are tired and grief makes exhaustion feel permanent. By November, after Evelyn's funeral, Richard had inserted himself into nearly every financial conversation connected to her estate. He framed it naturally, efficiently. He already knew the attorneys. He already had copies of paperwork, and he already understood timelines and account structures better than I supposedly did. "You shouldn't be dealing with this right now," he told me one evening while I sat at our kitchen island staring at a stack of probate documents I had read 3 times without absorbing. "Your head's not in the right place yet." Not cruel, concerned. That was always how he did it. He never removed authority from me directly. He positioned himself as relief from responsibility, until eventually the difference between support and control became difficult to identify. The frightening thing about slow manipulation is that it rarely feels like losing something in real time. It feels like resting. I remember one afternoon in late November, when Claire stopped by unexpectedly after work. She stood near the refrigerator in her wool coat watching Richard answer questions from Evelyn's attorney over speakerphone while I sat quietly at the table. After the call ended, Claire looked at me carefully. "Mom, are you okay letting Dad handle all this?" Richard answered before I could. "Your mother has enough on her plate." Claire hesitated just long enough for me to notice, then she nodded slowly. At the time, I told myself she looked uncertain because she was grieving too. Later I realized she was noticing the same shift I had spent months trying not to name. By December, Richard had begun speaking for me automatically in public again. "She gets overwhelmed with financial details now," or "Margaret's having trouble focusing since Evelyn passed." The language became smoother each time he repeated it, more practiced, like a story improving through rehearsal. The frightening part was how easily people accepted it. Neighbors accepted it because grief makes withdrawal look reasonable. Friends accepted it because Richard sounded compassionate. Even Ethan accepted it because sons often inherit their understanding of competence from the louder parent. Meanwhile, I watched not emotionally, structurally. That distinction matters. Most people think awareness arrives dramatically, a confrontation, a betrayal, a single, undeniable moment. For me, it arrived through paperwork. 3 days after Christmas, I drove alone to Evelyn's house to continue organizing her records before the estate sale. Snow covered the backyard in thin, uneven patches where dead grass still pushed through. Inside, the house smelled faintly like dust and peppermint tea. Evelyn had always been meticulous with documents, every cabinet labeled, every file dated neatly in blue ink. She believed records were a form of respect. That was why the inconsistency stood out immediately. One signature page in her trust amendment file looked wrong. Not obviously forged. Richard was smarter than that. But the pressure pattern felt inconsistent with Evelyn's handwriting during her final months. The slant was slightly stronger, the spacing too controlled. Most people would never notice. I noticed because years earlier, before I became Margaret Whitmore, the stay-at-home wife, I had spent over a decade noticing things people overlooked professionally. I sat at Evelyn's dining table for almost an hour with the document in front of me, then I opened the remaining files. The pattern widened slowly. Transfer dates clustered around specific hospitalizations. Authorization changes appeared during periods when Evelyn had been heavily medicated. Certain account summaries existed as copies rather than originals. Nothing dramatic, which was exactly what made it dangerous. Large theft attracts attention. Small irregularities survive because they resemble ordinary confusion. That night I returned home just after 7. Richard stood in the kitchen pouring bourbon into one of the crystal glasses we received as wedding gifts 28 years earlier. "You were gone a while," he said casually. "I stayed longer than I planned." He handed me a glass automatically before taking his own to the living room. The television played muted cable news nobody was actually watching. I sat across from him and studied his face while he spoke about interest rates and a zoning issue connected to one of his developments downtown. Steady voice, relaxed posture, no visible anxiety. Then, halfway through a sentence, he stopped, not completely, just enough. "What?" he asked. "Nothing." "You're looking at me strangely." I lowered my glass carefully onto the coaster beside me. "Did Evelyn ever sign financial authorizations while medicated?" The pause afterward lasted less than 2 seconds, but it existed. Richard leaned back slowly. "Where is this coming from?" "I'm asking." "She trusted me," he said evenly. "Someone had to handle things." Not an answer, a repositioning. I nodded once, like I accepted it. Then I watched him relax slightly. That was the moment I understood something important. Richard still believed I was grieving too heavily to think clearly, which meant he had underestimated the single worst possible person he could underestimate. Because long before I became his wife, before children and dinner parties and charity events, and 32 years of being introduced as Richard Whitmore's calm, supportive spouse, I had built my entire career around identifying financial fraud. And suddenly, after years of silence, I could feel the old instincts waking up again. Before I married Richard Whitmore, my last name was Hale. Before I became a wife, then a mother, then the woman, everyone politely described as graceful and supportive, I spent 12 years working for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Division in Washington. Not as an attorney, not as an agent carrying a badge and gun through dramatic hallway raids like television likes to imagine. I investigated patterns. That was my specialty. Money almost never disappears loudly. It shifts quietly, gradually hidden beneath ordinary transactions. People stop noticing because familiarity dulls attention. Most financial fraud survives because someone assumes no one patient enough will ever sit still long enough to map the entire structure. I used to be very patient. Apparently, I still was. 3 nights after I questioned Richard about Evelyn's signatures, I sat alone in the small study beside our bedroom, while snow drifted softly across the backyard outside the windows. The house was silent except for the low ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs. Richard had fallen asleep an hour earlier. I opened Evelyn's files across the desk and began building a timeline, not emotionally, methodically. Hospital admissions on the left side, medication records beside them, financial transfers aligned underneath. I highlighted authorization changes during periods where Evelyn's cognitive evaluations showed confusion or heavy sedation. The pattern clarified almost immediately once everything sat in the same visual field. Clusters repeated movements tied to dates Richard visited alone. The amounts themselves were careful, never large enough individually to trigger automatic concern. 30,000 here, 50,000 there. Consulting fees, temporary administrative adjustments, estate, coordination, reimbursements. Legitimate language disguises illegitimate behavior remarkably well. By 1:30 inches the morning, I found the first shell entity, Hion Civic Consulting LLC. The name sounded intentionally boring, which was usually a warning sign. No visible business operations, minimal public footprint, registered through a commercial filing service in Delaware. I searched additional transfers tied to the same routing structure and found 2 more entities connected through overlapping addresses. That was when the cold feeling settled low in my stomach, not panic, recognition. I had seen structures like this before. Richard wasn't improvising. He had been organizing this carefully. The next morning I drove into Boston alone and parked outside a narrow brick building in Back Bay, where an old colleague named Thomas Avery still worked private compliance investigations after leaving federal service. I had not seen Tom in nearly 14 years. He looked older now, thinner around the face, silver at the temples, but his eyes sharpened immediately when I handed him copies of the transfer summaries. We sat in silence for several minutes while he reviewed them. Finally, he leaned back slowly. "Well," he said quietly, "this certainly doesn't look accidental." I folded my hands together. "How bad?" Tom glanced toward me carefully before answering. "You want the honest version." I didn't come for comfort. That almost made him smile. He tapped one of the routing numbers lightly with his pen. "These entities are structured to avoid visibility. Whoever built this knew exactly how internal review thresholds work." He paused. "Margaret, this doesn't look like sloppy bookkeeping. It looks organized." The word lingered between us, organized. I stared at the papers without speaking. Outside, people hurried past the cafe windows in heavy coats, while snow collected in gray slush along the sidewalks. Somewhere nearby, a siren moved through traffic. Normal city sounds normal morning. And meanwhile, my entire marriage was rearranging itself in my head, not collapsing, rearranging. Because betrayal rarely destroys history cleanly. It forces you to revisit old moments and assign them new meaning. Suddenly, Richard's constant need for financial control looked different. The gradual isolation looked different. Even the petition looked different now, not emotional concern, preemptive positioning. "Do you think he knows you've noticed?" Tom asked finally. I thought about Richard watching me carefully over bourbon in the living room. "No," I said. "I think he still believes I stopped paying attention years ago." Tom nodded once. "That may be the only reason you're ahead right now." I left his office carrying photocopies inside a plain manila envelope that suddenly felt much heavier than paper should. That afternoon, Richard called while I was driving home. "How'd lunch with Claire go?" he asked casually. I tightened my grip slightly on the steering wheel. "I wasn't with Claire." A brief silence. "Oh," he said lightly, "I thought that's where you went." He was checking movement, confirming uncertainty. I looked through the windshield at slow-moving traffic crawling across the Mass Pike, while freezing rain blurred the skyline ahead. "I had errands," I replied. Richard hummed softly like the explanation satisfied him, but I heard something underneath it, now calculation. By February, the investigation had become the private center of my life, not obsession discipline. Every morning after Richard left for work, I reviewed records from Evelyn's estate, cross-referenced transfer timestamps, and mapped corporate filings connected to shell entities. Tom quietly helped me trace through public databases. The deeper I looked, the more careful Richard's structure appeared. He had spread movements across multiple channels, layered transactions beneath estate management costs, used periods of emotional distraction as operational cover, and for a while it probably worked. Because nobody expects theft to arrive wearing familiarity. One afternoon, Claire stopped by unexpectedly again. This time she found me surrounded by paperwork at the dining room table. She looked surprised. "I thought Dad said you weren't handling the estate anymore." I glanced up slowly. "Your father says many things confidently." Claire removed her coat carefully and sat across from me. Her eyes moved across the highlighted statements scattered between us. "What is all this?" For a moment I considered lying. Then I looked at my daughter's face and realized something painful. Richard had spent years controlling the narrative, partly because I kept protecting everyone from discomfort, including him. "I think your father may have moved money from Evelyn's estate," I said quietly. Claire froze. "Mom, I hope I'm wrong, but you don't think you are." I looked back down at the papers. "No," I admitted, "I don't." Claire sat very still after that, not angry, not emotional, just destabilized. Because children never really stop believing their parents exist within fixed moral structures. Discovering otherwise feels like losing geography. Finally, she spoke again. "Does Ethan know?" "Not yet." She nodded faintly, then her eyes narrowed slightly at one of the documents near my elbow. "I remember this company name." I looked up sharply. "Which one?" "High-End Civic," she said slowly. "Dad mentioned it last year during one of Grandma Evelyn's hospital stays. He said it was helping reorganize her trust administration." My heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up. Confirmation often arrives quietly. "You're sure?" Claire nodded once. "He sounded annoyed because Grandma kept asking questions about it." I wrote the memory down immediately, not because it proved everything but because patterns matter. Claire watched me carefully while I took notes. "You've done this before," she said softly. Not a question. I met her eyes. Yes. Something shifted in her expression, then, not fully understanding yet but beginning to see me differently, and I realized with sudden clarity that Richard's greatest mistake was never the money. It was assuming the version of me he preferred had become the only version left alive. The first formal inquiry reached Richard on a Tuesday morning. I knew because he came home for lunch. For 32 years my husband had followed routines with near-mechanical consistency: coffee at 6:30 office by 8:00 calls, scheduled in 15-minute blocks, lunch meetings arranged weeks in advance. Richard believed discipline created superiority, so when I heard the garage door opening at 11:40 inches the morning, I closed the file in front of me before he entered the kitchen. He stopped when he saw me sitting at the table, not startled, assessing. "You're home early," I said. "Meeting cancelled." A lie. Not a dramatic one, just smooth enough to pass if nobody examined it carefully. Richard loosened his tie and crossed toward the refrigerator while I watched him move through the kitchen we had renovated 12 years earlier. Together, marble countertops, soft gray cabinetry, the expensive warmth of a house designed to look effortless. People always assume wealth creates transparency. Usually it just creates better hiding places. "You've been busy lately," he said casually as he poured sparkling water into a glass. I folded my hands loosely together. "Have I? You seem occupied." There it was again, fishing without appearing to fish. I looked at him calmly. "I've had time to think." Richard nodded slowly, like that confirmed something disappointing but expected. "That's what worries me." I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny but because it was precise. For years, Richard had depended on my exhaustion, my distraction, my willingness to let conversations pass unfinished, because preserving peace felt easier than interrogating every subtle dismissal. Now I was thinking clearly again, and he could feel it. He sat across from me at the table, the untouched glass resting near his hand. "There's been some confusion regarding Evelyn's accounts," he said carefully. "Banks tend to overreact when estates are involved." I kept my face neutral. "What kind of confusion?" "Routine compliance reviews. Not false incomplete. The best manipulators rarely lie directly when truth can be rearranged instead." He watched me closely after saying it, waiting, measuring whether I already knew more. I lowered my eyes briefly toward the closed folder near my elbow. "Are they asking for documentation?" A pause, tiny but real. "Yes." "What kind?" "Administrative transfers. Estate reimbursements." He shrugged lightly. "Nothing significant." That word again, significant, as though importance could be determined by tone, instead of structure. I nodded once, then reached for my coffee. Richard relaxed slightly, and in that moment I realized something essential. He still believed this was manageable because he still believed he controlled the pace of discovery. What he didn't understand was that institutions move differently once patterns trigger internally, quietly, methodically, without emotion. Exactly the way I used to work. 2 days later, I met Olivia Grant for the first time. Her office overlooked the harbor downtown, all steel and muted blue carpeting, with shelves organized so precisely they looked untouched. Olivia herself appeared almost deceptively understated, mid-40s. Dark hair pinned neatly back, no dramatic courtroom energy, no oversized personality. People underestimated her instantly, which I suspected suited her perfectly. She reviewed the files without interruption for nearly 40 minutes while I sat across from her, listening to the faint hum of heating vents overhead. Finally, she closed the final folder carefully. "Your husband filed the conservatorship petition before these reviews escalated publicly," she said. "Yes, that timing matters." "I know." Her eyes lifted toward mine for the first time fully. "You were in financial crimes, not a question." "Yes, and he knows that. He knows I worked for the government before we had children." I paused slightly. "I don't believe he remembers enough specifics to feel threatened by it." Olivia leaned back slowly. "That may become important later." Outside the office windows, Boston Harbor looked almost silver beneath heavy February clouds. Ferries moved slowly through gray water while wind rattled softly against the glass. Olivia tapped one fingernail lightly against the folder. "Margaret, I need to ask you something directly." "All right. Do you believe Richard intended to isolate you gradually before filing this petition?" The question settled heavily between us because until that moment I had focused almost entirely on the financial structure itself, not the emotional architecture surrounding it. I thought about years of subtle correction. Margaret doesn't handle stress well anymore. Margaret gets confused with numbers. Margaret's grieving too heavily to manage details. Not dramatic statements, accumulation, carefully repeated identity erosion. Yes, I said finally. Olivia nodded once, like she had already suspected the answer. Then we proceed carefully, and careful became the center of everything afterward. The reviews widened quietly over the next 2 weeks. More document requests, additional transaction verification, compliance departments, contacting intermediary entities connected to the transfers. Richard began sleeping less. I noticed because he started walking downstairs around 2 or 3 in the morning, believing I remained asleep while he took calls from the kitchen in low controlled tones. One night, I followed silently halfway down the staircase and listened from the shadows near the landing. "No, that account stays untouched," he whispered sharply. "Do not move anything else right now." Silence. Then, "Because visibility creates patterns." I stood completely still after hearing that not emotional cold. Because innocent people do not speak about visibility that way. The next morning, Richard acted perfectly normal at breakfast. He discussed Ethan's upcoming promotion, mentioned weather delays near Hartford, and asked whether I needed groceries. The performance would have impressed anyone who didn't know him intimately, but stress had begun creating microscopic fractures in his rhythm. His coffee cup trembled once while he reached for it. His responses arrived half a second too late occasionally. And most importantly, he stopped underestimating my silence. Claire noticed it too. "He's nervous," she said quietly one afternoon after Richard left the room during Sunday dinner. Ethan frowned immediately. "Dad's not nervous." Claire looked toward me briefly before answering. "You haven't been watching him carefully." Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. At 32, my son still wanted morality to remain simple. Father stable, mother emotional, family structures understandable. But adulthood eventually forces everyone to recognize complexity whether they want to or not. 3 days later, Richard made his first serious mistake. One of the monitored shell accounts initiated another transfer during active review. Not large, just careless enough. The institution flagged it immediately, and because the account was already tied to pending compliance requests, the movement escalated automatically beyond internal banking review into a federal inquiry. When Olivia called me that evening, her voice remained calm but quieter than usual. "He moved money after review protocols were active," she said. "Yes." A pause followed. "Then that changes everything." I stood near the living room window while snow drifted softly across the dark backyard outside. Upstairs I could hear Richard moving through our bedroom, still unaware the ground beneath him had already started giving way. "What happens now?" I asked quietly. Olivia exhaled carefully. "Now," she said, "the system starts looking back. Courtrooms change slowly. That was something television never understood. No dramatic music swells when power shifts from one person to another. No visible tremor moves through the room announcing that someone's version of reality has begun collapsing. Most reversals happen quietly through posture attention and the gradual withdrawal of certainty. The second hearing took place on a Monday morning in March. Rain streaked the courthouse windows in thin silver lines while attorneys shuffled papers beneath fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly exhausted. Richard arrived early, dressed more carefully than usual, dark charcoal suit, blue tie hair trimmed shorter than normal. Control through presentation. He had built his entire life that way. When I entered courtroom 7B beside Olivia Grant, Richard looked toward me immediately, not casually, this time directly. There was something different in his expression now, not fear exactly, hyper-awareness, like someone standing on ice that had begun making sounds beneath them. I sat calmly beside Olivia and folded my hands together while the clerk called the session to order. Judge Elena Morales entered without ceremony. No one smiled. Richard's attorney Daniel Mercer stood first. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "my client remains deeply concerned about Mrs. Whitmore's deteriorating emotional condition and impaired judgment following the death of her sister." Judge Morales lifted one hand slightly. "Counselor," she interrupted, "before we continue, I'd like clarification regarding several financial reviews connected to the estate of Evelyn Hale." Daniel hesitated only briefly, but it was enough. Richard stared forward, very still beside him. Olivia rose slowly. "Your Honor, we've provided supplemental documentation regarding those reviews as requested." She handed a folder to the bailiff, who delivered it to the bench. Nobody spoke while Judge Morales reviewed the first pages. The silence stretched long enough for the room itself to begin feeling smaller. Finally the judge looked up. "These transfers," she said, carefully appear unusually structured. Richard shifted beside his attorney. Daniel cleared his throat lightly. "Your Honor, estate administration often involves temporary financial reallocations that may appear irregular without context." Olivia didn't immediately respond. That was one of the things I admired about her. She understood restraint professionally. Most attorneys rush to fill silence because silence feels dangerous to them. Olivia used silence like leverage. Mrs. Whitmore, Judge Morales said suddenly, looking toward me. Would you briefly explain your professional background for the record? Richard turned toward me immediately, not dramatically, but sharply enough for me to notice. I stood slowly. My name is Margaret Whitmore, I said calmly. Before leaving federal service, I spent 12 years investigating financial fraud and compliance violations for the Financial Crimes Enforcement Division. The courtroom became very quiet after that, not shocked, recalibrating. Daniel Mercer blinked once. Richard didn't move at all. Judge Morales folded her hands together lightly. And during your professional work, she asked, did you specialize in identifying transaction concealment patterns? Yes, Your Honor. Another silence, this one heavier. I watched Daniel glance toward Richard briefly for the first time since proceedings began, a tiny movement but revealing, because until now, Richard's entire case had depended on a specific image of me remaining intact, fragile, widow, emotionally diminished wife, dependent homemaker. Not investigator, not analyst, not someone professionally trained to detect deception. Judge Morales lowered her eyes briefly toward the files again. Mr. Mercer, she said. Were you aware of Mrs. Whitmore's investigative background before filing this conservatorship petition? Daniel hesitated. We were aware she had not participated in active employment for many years. That is not what I asked. His jaw tightened slightly. No, Your Honor. Across the courtroom I saw Richard's hand flex once against the table surface, a small involuntary movement, the kind stress creates before people realize it's visible. Olivia stepped forward then. Your Honor, the conservatorship petition asserts Mrs. Whitmore lacks the capacity to recognize financial risk. She paused briefly. What we are demonstrating instead is that Mrs. Whitmore identified transaction irregularities significant enough to trigger independent institutional review. She did not say fraud, not yet. She didn't need to. Judge Morales turned another page slowly. These compliance inquiries are active. Yes, Your Honor, Olivia replied, including review requests tied to post-notification transfer activity. That sentence landed differently because everyone in the room understood what it implied. Richard moved money after scrutiny had already begun. Judge Morales looked toward Richard directly now. Mr. Whitmore, she said evenly, did you authorize additional transfers from reviewed accounts after receiving institutional requests for documentation? Richard straightened slightly in his chair. Yes, but those transfers were legitimate operational adjustments. Were they disclosed? A pause then, not immediately. The judge nodded once. No emotion, which somehow made it worse. Daniel attempted recovery quickly. Your Honor, none of this changes the underlying concern regarding Mrs. Whitmore's emotional state following severe personal loss. I almost admired the effort, but the structure beneath his argument had already started collapsing. Judge Morales looked back toward me again. Mrs. Whitmore, she said carefully, did you independently compile the transaction timeline submitted to this court? Yes. And how long did that take? Approximately 7 weeks. And during that time, she continued, did you appear incapable of understanding financial structures? No, Your Honor. A faint sound escaped somewhere behind us from one of the observers seated near the back benches, not laughter recognition. Richard finally spoke then. She's making this look intentional, he said tightly. I was helping manage the family during a crisis. There it was, the shift. Not calm concern anymore, defense. Judge Morales watched him steadily. Mr. Whitmore, the issue before this court is not whether you intended to help. The issue is whether your petition rests on accurate representations regarding your wife's competence. Richard opened his mouth, closed it again. For the first time since I had married him, I saw him without narrative control, and it unsettled him visibly. Beside me, Olivia remained perfectly still. Judge Morales reviewed several additional pages silently before setting the folder down carefully. Based on the information currently before this court, she said the petition for emergency conservatorship is denied effective immediately. The words arrived quietly, but they altered everything. Richard stared forward motionless. Daniel lowered his eyes toward the table. Somewhere behind us I heard someone exhale slowly. Judge Morales wasn't finished. Additionally, she continued, given the ongoing financial review activity associated with these transactions, this court will formally refer supporting documentation for further evaluation. Referral. Not accusation, not conviction, worse process. Richard understood that immediately. I could see it in his face now. The careful confidence he wore so naturally had started thinning around the edges, not broken yet, but cracking. Judge Morales lifted the gavel lightly. This hearing is adjourned. The sound echoed once through the room, and just like that, the version of me Richard had spent years constructing for other people stopped existing publicly. The courthouse doors closed behind us with a heavy metallic sound that lingered longer than it should have. Outside March, rain soaked the courthouse steps and turned the sidewalks dark with water. Reporters stood farther down the block near another hearing, entirely unrelated to ours, their umbrellas tilted against the wind. Nobody noticed us leaving. Richard would have hated that. For most of our marriage, visibility had been oxygen to him. He liked entering rooms where people recognized his name, liked handshakes that lasted slightly too long, liked introducing himself through accomplishments before conversations even began. Now he walked beside his attorney in silence, eyes fixed ahead, while Olivia and I moved several steps behind them toward the parking structure. Neither of us spoke until the elevator doors closed. Then Olivia exhaled softly. He didn't expect the referral. No, I said. He expected embarrassment, not process. Olivia nodded once. That's usually what people misunderstand about financial investigations. They imagine dramatic moments. She glanced toward the glowing floor numbers above us. The real damage happened slowly. The elevator opened on level 3. Rain hammered softly against the concrete walls outside while we crossed toward my car. Before we reached it, my phone vibrated. Ethan. I stopped walking. Olivia looked toward me briefly. You should answer. I already knew from the timing that something inside him had shifted. Mom. His voice sounded tight, not angry, disoriented. Yes. I just left Dad. I leaned lightly against the side of the car while rain rattled across the parking structure overhead. Okay. He told me the judge overreacted. I closed my eyes briefly. That sounds like your father. Silence stretched between us, then Ethan spoke more quietly. Did you really work financial crimes? There it was, not accusation, recalibration. Yes. Why didn't I know that? You did, I said gently. You just knew the shortened version. He didn't answer immediately. I could almost hear him reconstructing years in real time, all those dinners where Richard handled financial discussions. All those moments where I stayed quiet because contradicting him publicly seemed unnecessary. All those introductions. Your mother stayed home with you kids. Margaret hates numbers. She leaves the complicated stuff to me. People rarely question a narrative repeated consistently enough, especially children. I think Dad lied to me, Ethan said finally. The sentence came out strained, like something physically difficult to say aloud. I looked across the rain-dark skyline beyond the parking garage openings. No, I said carefully. I think your father edited reality until he started believing his own version more than the truth. That mattered because Richard did not experience himself as a villain. He experienced himself as necessary. Control had become so intertwined with identity for him that losing authority now felt in his mind like betrayal inflicted against him, rather than consequence created by him. I don't know what to think, Ethan admitted quietly. You don't need to decide everything today. Another silence then. Were you investigating him the whole time? The rain intensified briefly overhead. No, I said honestly. At first I was trying to understand him. After we hung up, Olivia remained beside me without speaking. Finally, she said, that was kind. I unlocked the car slowly. It was true the investigations expanded rapidly after the court referral, not publicly, quietly. Banks requested additional verification from intermediary entities connected to the shell company's compliance divisions, flagged overlapping transfers tied to Richard's development partnerships, and internal auditors started asking questions that required documented answers instead of verbal explanations. And Richard had built too much of the structure around verbal trust. 3 days later, Claire came to the house alone. Richard was still downtown meeting attorneys. She stood near the kitchen island, removing wet gloves carefully while I made tea. He's angry, she said softly. I handed her a cup. Yes, he keeps saying you humiliated him. I almost smiled at that. Interesting word choice, humiliation. Not misunderstanding, not mistake, not confusion. Humiliation, as though exposure itself had become injury. Claire sat quietly for a moment before speaking again. I asked him directly about High-End Civic. I looked toward her, and he said, "You're twisting ordinary business operations into something ugly because grief made you paranoid." There was no bitterness in her voice while repeating it, only sadness. I sat across from her slowly. Did you believe him? Claire stared down into her tea. I wanted to. That hurt more than accusation would have, because wanting to believe someone is often the final fragile layer before trust breaks completely. He keeps acting like you betrayed him, she whispered. I folded my hands together loosely. People who depend on control often experience accountability as betrayal. Claire looked at me then with an expression I recognized immediately, adult recognition, the painful moment children begin understanding their parents as flawed human beings instead of permanent emotional architecture. Did you ever love him? She asked quietly. The question surprised me, not because it was difficult, but because it deserved honesty. Yes, I said after a moment, very much. Claire nodded faintly, like that answer somehow made the situation sadder instead of simpler. And maybe it did. By April, Richard's business partners had started distancing themselves carefully, not publicly abandoning him. That comes later. First comes hesitation, delayed responses, canceled lunches, conversations through attorneys instead of direct calls. One evening, Richard came home later than usual and stood silently in the kitchen while I reviewed documents near the dining room window. The house felt enormous around us now, not hostile, vacant. He loosened his tie slowly. "You've destroyed 30 years, he said quietly. I looked up from the papers. "No," I replied, "the truth did." His jaw tightened. "You think you're innocent in this? Interesting, not you're wrong. You're innocent," as though morality itself had become negotiable terrain. "I think I stopped protecting lies," I said calmly. Richard stared at me for several long seconds, then something inside him finally cracked. Not loudly. That would have been easier. Instead, his exhaustion surfaced all at once beneath the performance. "I gave this family everything," he said tightly. "Money, stability, status, authority." In Richard's mind, those things justified almost anything. I studied his face carefully then, and for the first time in months, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not satisfaction, grief. Because beneath all the manipulation and concealment sat a man who genuinely believed love and control were interchangeable concepts. And people like that rarely understand what they've destroyed until there's nobody left willing to participate in the illusion anymore. 3 days later, Olivia called just after sunset. Her voice sounded calm as always, but sharper. They found another account. I stood near the living room window watching evening light fade across the backyard. "What kind of account?" "Offshore." Silence. "Then it's tied in directly to one of the development partnerships." I closed my eyes briefly. There it was, the thing Richard had probably convinced himself nobody would ever reach. "What happens now?" I asked quietly. Olivia paused, then she answered carefully. "Now they start discussing criminal exposure." And somewhere upstairs in the house we once built together, I heard Richard moving through the dark alone. The plea agreement was finalized on a Thursday morning in late May. No reporters waited outside the federal building. No cameras followed anyone down courthouse steps. Financial cases rarely attract public fascination unless celebrities are involved, and Richard Whitmore had spent too many years operating in respectable silence to become headline material overnight. In the end, the resolution arrived the same way the truth had: quietly. Restitution agreements, financial penalties, restricted business activity, ongoing monitoring. No prison sentence, at least not immediately. Olivia explained the terms to me from across her office, while afternoon sunlight reflected softly against the harbor windows behind her. "He cooperated once the offshore structure surfaced," she said. "That mattered." I nodded slowly. Richard always understood negotiation. Even collapse became strategic eventually. He admitted everything. Olivia considered the question carefully. "Not emotionally," she replied, "but legally, yes." That sounded exactly like him. I thanked her, gathered my coat, and left the office alone. Outside, Boston had finally turned warm again. The air smelled faintly of seawater and pavement heating beneath the sun. People crossed intersections, carrying iced coffee and talking into phones, their lives continuing untouched beside mine. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, longer than necessary, not overwhelmed, just still. Because after months of investigation, hearings, documents, timelines, and revelations, the ending itself felt strangely small. That is the thing nobody tells you about surviving betrayal. The truth does not explode when it finally arrives. It settles. Richard moved out 2 weeks later. Not dramatically, no screaming, no broken dishes, no final confrontation in the driveway. A moving company arrived at 9 in the morning while I sat in the sunroom, reviewing emails from a private consulting firm in D.C. that had quietly approached me about returning to investigative work part-time. I heard drawers opening upstairs, footsteps crossing hallways, closet doors sliding shut. 32 years of marriage reduced to labeled cardboard boxes and careful silence. At one point, Richard appeared in the doorway holding an old framed photograph from our anniversary trip to Maine years earlier. We both looked younger in it, less careful. He studied the picture for several seconds before speaking. "I did love you," he said quietly. The sentence lingered in the room between us, not manipulative, not defensive, just tired. I closed my laptop slowly. "I know." That seemed to surprise him more than anger would have. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then he looked down at the photograph again. "I don't think I understood when things changed," he admitted. I watched sunlight move softly across the hardwood floor near his shoes. "No," I said gently, "you understood. You just thought control was the same thing as keeping someone safe." Richard's jaw tightened faintly, but he didn't argue. Because somewhere beneath all the ego and denial and carefully constructed authority, I think he finally recognized the shape of what he had become. Not a monster that would have been easier. Just a man who slowly convinced himself that love entitled him to ownership. He left 20 minutes later carrying the photograph under one arm. I never saw it again. Summer arrived gradually after that. The house changed first, not physically, emotionally. Rooms that once felt tense became quiet in a different way now, lighter. Claire visited more often. Ethan started calling every Sunday morning without obligation attached to it. Sometimes we spoke about the investigation. More often we didn't. Healing rarely happens through dramatic conversations. Usually, it happens through ordinary moments, repeating consistently enough that trust slowly rebuilds itself. One evening in July, Ethan sat across from me on the back patio while cicadas hummed softly in the trees behind the yard. I keep replaying things, he admitted, trying to figure out how I missed what Dad was doing. I set my wine glass down carefully. You were his son. That's not an excuse. No, I agreed, but it's an explanation. Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring out across the dark lawn. I think he needed everyone to see him a certain way. Yes, and I think you spent years helping him do that. The honesty in the statement almost hurt because it was true. I nodded once. I did. Why? I thought about that carefully before answering. Because the real reasons people stay quiet inside marriages are rarely simple. Sometimes maintaining peace feels easier than correcting someone constantly, I said softly, and after enough years you stop noticing how much of yourself disappeared inside that peace. Ethan looked down at his hands. I'm sorry, Mom. I reached across the table and touched his wrist lightly. You don't owe me punishment for loving your father. The cicadas continued humming around us in the warm dark, and for the first time in a very long while the silence between us felt healthy. In August, I drove alone to Providence to visit Evelyn's grave. The cemetery overlooked a small stretch of water where sailboats moved slowly beneath pale afternoon clouds. Someone had recently placed fresh white lilies beside her headstone, probably Claire. I sat on the grass for a while without speaking, not because I believed she could hear me, but because grief changes shape when enough time passes. It becomes less like drowning and more like carrying something carefully. Eventually, I took the small leather journal from my bag and opened to the final page again times. If something doesn't feel right, you'll see it. I smiled faintly. Even now that sentence sounded exactly like Evelyn, direct, practical, quietly certain. I closed the journal and looked out across the water. For years, Richard had mistaken my silence for absence. So had other people. They saw calmness and assumed weakness, saw restraint and assumed passivity, saw domestic life and assumed intellectual disappearance. But people only call women invisible after they've stopped looking carefully, and the truth was this. I had never stopped seeing, not really. My husband thought being quiet meant I had nothing left to say. He never understood that silence is where I learned to watch. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to know what part touched you most. Leave a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight. Stories like this remind us how easily people can be underestimated, and how powerful quiet strength can become when the truth finally has room to breathe. We have many more stories waiting for you here, stories about family betrayal, resilience, and the moments that change people forever. So if you'd like to continue this journey with us, subscribe and stay close. You never know which story will feel a little too familiar.